Hello, my name is Kyle Quarles. I'll be presenting my composition Fragments 15.0 to 15.7, Ockeghem Anamorph. Overview of the piece: it's based on a chanson by Ockeghem from the 15th century. It's a rondeau. It uses guided improvisation inside MSP based on that original composition. Section of the beginning of the piece just to give an idea of what it's like, and then we'll go into details. So hopefully that gives you an idea. As you can see, the performers are interacting with the electronics while they sing, and we'll be talking about what they're doing. Here is the original chanson that this is based off of, so you can get a little bit of the idea of the sound world of that piece, and you'll see the manuscript. On the right, it is unicum to the Dijon chansonnier. It's the only manuscript it occurs in. Here's the text of the original. Some of the most interesting lines here are actually in this second to last stanza here, and it follows the standard repetition scheme of the rondeau. So actually, where this trails off, you would repeat this first stanza here, but some very evocative lines regarding the feeling of loss. Here is some pictures of the original transcription that I did. This was all by ear, so it's based on that particular performance that you just heard off YouTube. So any choices in ficta in that performance or any mistakes in the transcription are embedded in the material later subjected to mathematical analysis. And at that time, I was very much interested in photographic realism and a particular painting by Gerhard Richter, which appears on the right, which is a picture of the two towers on September 11th. However, you can see he's scraped the paint across the canvas sort of after he's done this photorealistic painting, and it almost looks like a Polaroid that's been crushed and stuffed in a pocket, and the image itself is sort of behind this artificial veil that is nonetheless part of the artistic work, and that idea appealed to me, hence the focus on oral transcription here. So in the transcription, you can see these colored pencil marks. These are markings of the phrases in the composition. This becomes important later on. Here you can see a detail of the first measure of my transcription. There's these graphs that are penciled in the margins. These graphs use pitch class integer notation and interval class integer notation to model the voice leading of a particular phrase. And so you can see here, this is the graph model for the first phrase of the tenor, and here's the graph model for the first phrase of the bass. So in this bass line, you'll see this G occurs before this C, and then it goes to this G below. So I consider this as a network of, okay, G can go to C and C can go to G. So therefore I draw a 7 for G and a 0 for C, and I draw an edge between them. And then later on, this G goes back to C, and this C can go to D. So I draw an edge from 0 to 2, 2 being D. This D can go to E flat, so I draw an edge from 2 to 3, 3 being E flat, etc. And by the end of this process, when we get to the end of the phrase, we complete all the edges we need to draw, and this gives us a sort of model of the phrase. And I draw these graphs for every phrase in the composition. Then I input them into the computer, and some other measurements here, like the probability that a certain note goes to which. Circle notes are beginnings of phrases. Stuff on the above the circle node is higher than that node, higher pitch, and things below it are lower pitches. And so there's many properties that you can deduce from these structures. Degree of transfer from the high to low side, or does it always pass through that beginning pitch? Degree of recursion. Some of these are much more linear than others. And these give the sort of characteristic flavor of of the Ockeghem, and these can be considered one-dimensional Markov models. Those graphs are then given to the performer, and that's what you see them improvising with in the video. They are clicking on nodes following the permitted paths that are derived from the Ockeghem. The performers are given those graphs in the same order as the Ockeghem, but the timing and structuring of them is slightly different. The text is tied to those graphs, however, so like when a particular phrase occurs in the Ockeghem with a certain set of text, that voice-leading graph will occur with the text that occurs with that phrase in the composition. The most unique part of my piece is that it uses these 7 algorithmic textures, which are listed above. These give basically general instructions with a range of parameters that the performers are to follow. These always change with dynamic range, and there are 7 of these total in the entire composition. The graphs change with the lyrics always. Which graph is active is indicated here. And finally, there is a green light, red light system that preserves silences and points of imitation in the original. When that graph is active in the phrase model, the light will be green and the performer is indicated that they're free to improvise. And when the light turns red, they're requested to remain silent. You stop the piece by clicking here, and you start it by clicking here. And here's the clock to keep track of where you are. The precise times of when the performer is given a new graph, texture, and red or green light is hard-coded in advance, and these patterns delineate the form. So here's the model of the entire graph structure for the entire piece. This top row is the soprano, this middle row is the tenor, and the bottom row is the bass. So as you can see, the phrase structure between voices does not always line up, but this is one of the primary features of this style and of Ockeghem in particular. So sometimes we have very long phrases, whereas in another voice we might have 2. So here it's very obvious, like the bass is changing phrases at the same time as the soprano, and yet the countertenor, or the tenor line, has a phrase that runs through both of them and provides this contrast. Spaces here, so if you see a space, this is a silence or a waiting point where this voice has rests, and all those rests are preserved in my composition. So I give this entire structure, when the improviser is given these graphs, they're given these graphs in the same order always, and it basically follows this scheme of the rondeau. The only thing I'm changing really is how long each one of these graphs lasts. So I'll take the original timing of the original, and I will progressively over the course of the composition, each one of these graphs is going to last progressively longer and longer. So you get this sort of time stretching effect, even though the relationships between all these graphs, when the bass is improvising with this graph versus when the soprano is improvising with this graph, etc., when they have silences and waiting points, although those get stretched, they're always in the same proportion in relation to each other on each pass. And the form of my composition follows the form of the rondeau. So this A and B section together all the way through the form, and then we get 3 repetitions of the A, just the A graphs, and then we get finally a B-A-B at the end. These are the 7 textures that I use. I'll give short audio examples of each of them. Remember that each one of these textures, it's like we start back over at the A section again for most of them. Here's the first texture. Here's the second texture. Third texture. This next section is where I manipulate the original rondeau form a little bit. I give 3. Prior to this, we've had 1 texture per pass of the lyrics and the form of the composition. But here we're going to have 3 textures for 1 pass through the entire form. So there's a sort of increasing complexity towards this sort of cadence point in the composition. We basically retain that texture for the next section. We just decrease the density. Finally here, penultimate. And remember, each one of these textures, the graph length is getting increased by a certain constant number of seconds each time. So by the end of this last texture, the graphs last much longer than they do in the original Ockeghem. sketch of that idea where I was originally working out, okay, which texture is going to be for what times. Here I was recording the original length in seconds that each graph lasts, and then here I am scaling it up each time. Here's that information with a final form I decided upon. Any pink cell is a new texture, and each one of these individual cells with a number in it is the timestamp that a new graph happens. So you see those timestamps are not the same depending on the voice. So whereas the soprano changes to their new graph here, the tenor has a 2-second silence in red, and then their new graph starts at the 22nd second mark. And those differentials increase over time. So those silences get bigger. That's why these silences are increasing in a length of 1 second with each iteration of the form. And also the timestamps and how long each graph lasts increases. So by the end, it's about a 20-second difference in terms of how long each graph is lasting. And that graph is connected to the text, and that's what's indicated here. Here is a visual representation of what that would look like if you mapped out each texture linearly, if we had to have some sort of score. This is a sheet that was given to the performers that they actually requested to have them help them get a global overview of what was the entire composition should sort of look like formally. You'll notice they all changed textures at the same time until we start getting into these staccati textures, in which case now the entrances are staggered. And so again, there's a sort of deconstruction of the formal model toward the center and denouement of the piece. And of course, this section is much longer. It's very clear to see here compared to the beginning and the end. So in conclusion, there's degrees of freedom when you compose like this, and it's very important to get the right balance of kinds of freedom you can give the performers and kinds of freedom to take away. So one example being, originally I'd composed a much more extensive system to give these textures to the performers. I ended up simplifying it to these simple textual instructions because it was just very obvious once I had tried to control this more directly, precisely how long algorithmically they were to crescendo and decrescendo for, and to control this on a much more micro level, that it was taking away some of the magic of the performance and the will of the performer in a negative way. However, there are other ways in which I've severely limited the freedom of the performer in the case of being able to which nodes they're permitted to click and which paths they're permitted to take and which graph they're given at any given time to improvise with. This interface gives many possibilities for extension. It's definitely possible to have an audience member or a conductor of some kind controlling one or more of these parameters. This technique scales very easily to large choirs, so some of the textures would very easily be increased in effectiveness with more singers. One of the most promising applications, I think, is, I didn't do it on this particular iteration of this piece, but microtonal playback is certainly possible. Microtonal accuracy is possible with this system because you can always click on a node to double check your pitch, and that was designed deliberately to extend into that world. I'd like to close with a little bit of a philosophical notion. These were actually quotes or notes I took and wrote to myself during the composition of this piece. These are taken off the manuscript. The question my piece asks is, did you hear everything I wrote here before? And musically juxtaposing my graph realizations with the actual Ockeghem from whence they're derived tests for the isography of the two, and to the extent that we accept the connection between them, we accept what is a theoretical construction as an immanent fact. Thank you.